So, for those of you who don't know me, which may be nobody, but I don't know, folks I'm watching, my name is Jim Sullivan. I work at the Bennington County Regional Commission and have for many years, work on a lot of town planning projects. And with me is Catherine Briers, who's been working on a lot of our energy planning work since she started with us a few months ago. And Jim Henderson is showing up too, so we have a good BCRC turnout today. The main purpose of tonight's meeting is to impart some general information about this Act 174, the new energy planning law that was passed last year in the legislature, and to talk about what that means for town and regional planning. This is part of a presentation that was put together on a statewide basis. So it's a lot of it is a bit generic. I've tried to throw in some slides relevant to our region to illustrate some of the points. But I want this very much to be a back and forth. So please ask me any questions, because this is really about getting your questions answered about what this law is and what it means to towns. We don't have all of the answers. This is the first time that we've done this. This is the first time the state's really done anything like this. So if we don't know the answer, we won't make it up. We will look and find the answer. So what we will be talking about, I've talked about, an overview of what this law is and how it relates to. So it's Section 248, which is what some of you are familiar with, the Public Service Board's hearing process for citing renewable generation projects and transmission projects. It's got somewhat similar to Act 250, but in the realm of energy generation and transmission. The planning standards, those two documents that Nancy let me borrow to hold up, what it means for municipal plans, what you might want to do with your town plans, and the kind of support that's available to municipalities. What we won't be talking about so much, but we can talk about it another time because it's lots of fun to talk about, is state energy policy and plans and the assumptions that underlie those plans. A lot of this is based on the state's comprehensive energy plan and the assumptions that are baked into that plan. We'll touch on it briefly, but we could talk about that all night. And likewise, the draft BCRC regional energy plan that we had two public meetings on, one in the middle of November and one on December 1st. And we will be having additional public meetings on that come the new year. There are bits and pieces of the BCRC Regional Energy Plan in this presentation. So in the way of trying to keep this dialogue going, please just shoot your hand up anytime you've got a question, and we'll try to answer it before we move on to something else. Okay. So this one does go a little background in energy planning. Why would we bother doing energy planning in the first place? One is environmental reasons, and those certainly range from climate change and weather events that are resulting from climate change to more local things like air pollution and impacts on the environment from combustion-related energy development, things like that. Economic reasons. The fact that in our region we spend, just statewide, we spend over $5,000 per person on energy every year, and in our region that amounts to over $150 million. So there's a significant amount of money that's going into spending on energy of all kinds, and I'm talking about heating houses and moving cars and powering industry and lighting up lights and slide projectors and everything else. And where does that money go that we're spending on energy? A lot of it leaves the state because a lot of our energy is imported from out of state. And what are the implications of potential opportunities for keeping some of that money within the local economies, as well as what are the possible direct economic benefits of job creation and business development associated with things like weatherization and use of alternative fuels. And long-term energy security, that's the question, kind of like goes back to the fact that a lot of our energy is imported. We don't know for sure what the energy situation is going to be like as far as availability and cost of the energy that we're relying on now, which is the vast majority of which is imported fossil fuel energy. And then also a lot of our electricity comes from imported sources. In fact, the vast majority of it does. What happens if those sources become constrained or the costs of those things go up? Is there a way for us to have more control over those things in the future to reduce uncertainty in our future energy supply? So those are the things that if you look into the state's comprehensive energy plan, if you look into the BCRC's energy plan, that we talk about a lot. And your municipal energy plans are probably not going to go into those big picture things. That's a lot of the rationale that underlies why we're doing the energy planning in the first place. So a little bit of background on energy planning in Vermont, which goes back before 2011. Certainly, the first Vermont energy plan I read through was the one before 2011, so it was probably 8 or 9 years ago. And I remember reading that and not being an energy expert myself, but still being struck by the fact that that energy plan didn't even deal with oil. I was like, something is missing here, because that's how we heat our homes, and that's the basis for most of our transportation fuels, and it's not in the state's energy plan. It really dealt mostly with electricity and natural gas, which are kind of the regulated utilities, if you will, which is why it's in the energy plan. But you're really not doing a good job of understanding the whole energy picture and how it affects our lives and economies if we're not looking at energy very comprehensively. So the 2011 energy plan got much more in that direction. And then that's where some of these goals that we'll talk about a little bit were laid out, that the state should aspire to, as far as reducing the amount of energy we use or waste and finding alternative sources for energy. But there wasn't any really good understanding of how we might get there. And so the Public Service Department was directed to prepare a study to figure out some potential pathways for meeting those goals that were discussed in the 2011 energy plan, as well as some of the legislative goals that had been enacted around that time. And that was done in this thing called the Total Energy Study, which was like pathways forward, like what type of policies, what type of public investments, what type of incentive programs might work together to move us in the right direction. And that study did a lot to inform the most recent state's energy plan, the 2016 Comprehensive Energy Plan, which is a really good, thorough assessment of our energy situation currently, and looking forward. I think really looking forward is how we can move the ball forward in meeting the state's identified objectives. This was done just as we were starting a new regional energy plan development that has been funded through the Public Service Department. They originally provided funding for 3 regional planning commissions to develop draft regional energy plans. The Bennington region was one of those. Another was the Two Rivers Adequachi Regional Commission over near Woodstock, and the other was the Northwest Regional Commission up in the St. Albans area and to the islands. So our plans have been in development for a while. And we have a more or less complete draft that you can see on our website. At the same time, within the last few months, the other 8 regional planning commissions in the state have started a similar process, developing plans, kind of following the path that was laid out by the pilot planning projects. And these plans, by the way, are fully expected, we were told by the state. The next comprehensive energy plan is coming up in 2021. I think it's a 5-year cycle. And the information and kind of the local information that we're pulling into our regional energy plans is supposed to feed in and inform that next state energy plan. Just something that really hasn't been part of the state energy planning process in the past. So this is just a list of some of the state's energy goals. Some of them are laid out in the comprehensive energy plan. Some of them were enacted legislatively. They deal with things like the amount of energy that we hope to get from in-state renewable energy generation by 2025. A lot of it goes back to greenhouse gas emissions that we're trying to significantly drive down the amount of greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont. And then there's some really specific things like how many homes should be weatherized by certain benchmark points in time. 2017 is not very far away. And so we're, as far as we know, we're not near that goal. So there are certainly some challenges. A lot of these goals, and there are more, but a lot of these goals kind of have been pulled together to try to develop this overarching energy goal that was set forth in the comprehensive energy plan, and that's this assessment of this notion that Vermont should work toward getting 90% of all of its energy from renewable sources by 2050. And I won't go into a lot of that. There's my regional plan presentation has a lot of information on that, but basically that is kind of what our regional plans are directed toward, and what the expectation is that the municipal planning effort that we'll talk about tonight should be trying to support as well. And that goal in and of itself, to realize that goal, a very short version of it is one really important thing has to happen, and that is we have to use a lot less energy than we're using now. That's probably the most important lesson from that goal, is that statewide and regionally we probably have to use about a third less energy than we're using now. And we can do that through conservation measures, just making intelligent use of the energy sources we have to use less, as well as efficiency improvements, which is basically like if we were to replace internal combustion engines by and large with electric motors in our light duty transportation fleet, just those efficiency improvements alone significantly reduce the amount of energy demand that we have. And also, there's this a big shift toward electricity in general, because electricity is, while not an energy source itself, it's a way of delivering energy, and it can be delivered from renewable or non-renewable sources, but it gives us an opportunity to choose renewable energy sources, hydroelectric power, wind power, solar power, things like that. And then convert that to electricity, and then use electricity for a whole variety of different applications. So that is goal basis. And then there's just a quick slide in there that gives a little bit more history on energy planning, and just kind of the notion that comprehensive energy planning really requires planning across all sectors. It requires us to think very broadly, because energy really permeates all aspects of everything that we do. So we need to think about it in terms of transportation and land use and everything else. And kind of a recognition that there was maybe a little bit of a disconnect historically between our land use planning and our energy planning, our siting of new facilities, really came about when Governor Shumlin appointed this Energy Generation Siting Policy Commission. Actually had a much longer name than that, I think, back in 2013, to say we've got some concern. People have concerns about the impacts of siting renewable energy facilities and potentially other kinds of energy facilities too, and transmission facilities on our landscape. That a lot of our laws were set up for siting these things when a new energy facility was a nuclear power plant, or some other type of a large natural gas and biomass facility like the McNeil plant up in Burlington. And they were things where you would probably expect to get like one of those every 20 or 30 years in one location that you could pick and control pretty well. And now all of a sudden, as all these renewable projects started to appear on the scene, we had solar projects and wind projects and people talking about reestablishing hydroelectric facilities, and they were happening all over the landscape at a very different scale, and without having the basic underlying law really set up to think about how you handle that. Yes, Cynthia?
Maybe you're getting to this, but just in case people don't know, that section 248 that you mentioned earlier removes energy facility siting from any kind of local zoning process or Act 250, and it puts it solely under the Public Service Board. So that's why when we start having projects in a lot of different places and neighbors and towns are having issues, they can't use zoning, they can't use Act 250 because that's been taken out of that process. So that's why they had to start saying, oh yeah, okay, this is a problem, like you say, because it's not just one giant thing in one place.
Right.
It's like a lot of different places and a lot of people are being impacted. I just didn't know if people understood why it's not coming through the planning.
That's a really good point. Thanks for raising that. And Cynthia, for those who don't know, is involved in this as a legislator as well. So her perspective is very much appreciated. You're absolutely right. That towns are used to being able to have some level of local regulation over land use decisions. And here are essentially land use decisions that towns are not allowed to regulate directly through their local land use regulations. They're treated through the Section 248 process and with so-called certificates of public good granted by the Public Service Board, and those. We'll definitely talk a little bit more about this and answer questions, but the Public Service Board considers town plans as part of that. There's a question of how well or effectively they consider town and regional plans, or have considered those, but they just kind of consider them. There's not the kind of the heavy weight applied to them as there is in Act 250. So the next thing that came up is they made some fairly specific recommendations came out of that Siting Commission in 2013. Interestingly enough, a lot of them dealt with planning, but they didn't really go anywhere right away. And in the meantime, there was a solar siting task force that was put into place, trying to deal with some immediate concerns, to try to figure out some things that towns and regions could do quickly to try to get a better handle on all the solar projects that were starting to appear all over the landscape. So they came up with some fairly specific recommendations and some things that were put into statute fairly quickly, relatively minor things. They basically enabled towns to enact ordinances covering screening of solar facilities, for example. So you could require screening of a solar facility as long as the screening requirements were consistent with what a town would require for screening for other types of commercial developments. So things of that nature. They weren't big sweeping changes, but there were some things that towns could do, and a few towns have developed ordinances to do that. Then we come along to the main point of tonight's meeting is Act 174, which was passed in this most recent legislative session. And that is an attempt to deal with the siting issue where and how these things are located and how they're regulated, but also all of the rest of the stuff that energy plays into, like transportation. So it says this is an energy a law that deals with the siting of energy facilities, but it also is meant to deal with energy very comprehensively, because it really wanted people to say, okay, why are we building these renewable energy facilities anyway? It says really need to understand the whole span of energy use and energy development. So, transportation, so plan for, it's about planning and it's about siting. So it's like understand and plan for transportation. Housing, how is it a big issue in housing? I mean, I put the picture of Applegate on there as just an example, because there happens to be a weatherization and conversion to a biomass heating system going on at Applegate, the apartment project in Bennington. But there's a whole realm of housing and land use issues associated with energy. And land use, that's just a picture of our regional land use plan, and the idea that you can do a lot for energy, and you should really be thinking about energy when you're planning for land use, not just where you might want to locate wind turbines or solar panels or hydroelectric facilities, but where you want to locate new development. How can you encourage kind of concentrations of mixed-use development, kind of commercial uses and residential uses at higher densities near established village centers and downtowns, which are inherently more energy efficient because people don't have to drive so much to get from place to place, and buildings can be made much more energy efficient and so on. And economic development, I mean, that just happens to be a picture of a direct economic development of a biodiesel production facility in the region. But kind of going back to the things we talked about earlier about how could we think about energy in a way that supports the local and regional economy. Again, so these, let me talk about the regional energy planning projects, and happy to take your questions too. This is a really quick overview, but one of the things that we have to do in our regional energy plans, according to our agreement with the state, is to evaluate current energy use. So we have in our plan kind of estimates of energy use across all sector. How much is used for heating houses in the region, and where are those fuel sources? What are those fuel sources? How much oil do we use? How much propane do we use? How much cordwood do we use? Things of that nature. And then, it's likewise transportation. How much gas do we put into our gas tanks, and diesel do we put into our trucks and buses and so on? And how much electricity do we use? So the plan has estimates of all those, gives us that big picture. Where are we now, right? That's how we're supposed to start most of our plans. Where are we now? And then the tricky part, very tricky part, is saying, okay, that's where we are now, or that's where we were in 2010. This is the mix of all those fuel uses, where we are now, and that's 2050. How do we get there over the next 35 years or so? And this downward trending bar chart, basically that's the conservation and efficiency stuff that I talked about earlier. That's reducing the total amount of energy use. The height of these things is basically the total amount of energy use in the region. And so how do we get from here down to here? How do we shrink the bar chart over time? And within that bar chart, how do we take all those non-renewable fuels and kind of compress them from what right now is like about this much down to about this much. And that's a tricky thing. This is all done by the modeling is done by a program called the Long Range Energy Alternatives Planning Module, or something that's something that the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation run, and it's basically based on a whole bunch of assumptions. I mean, it's not the kind of thing that says, well, this is exactly what's going to happen. It's like, well, based on this set of assumptions implemented in this way will get us to here and you meet your objectives. There's other assumptions you could build in and change things around, and that's discussed in our regional energy plan. But that's, so this is kind of like, at least it gives us an idea, it gives us a picture of the kinds of changes that would have to be made if we want to move in the direction of meeting those state objectives.
What is CNG?
That's compressed natural gas. So, and I should point out too, I'll go backwards, that you know, in this modeling, some of the data fields that go into that are based on statewide data because there's no regional data available. So, like, there's a little bit of coal or something in there somewhere too. You know, it's like, well, we, as far as I know, don't burn much of any coal in our region, but somewhere in Vermont, somewhere it does. So a small fraction of it showed up in our region. But we get more true to our region as we go forward in time. And then, again, we talked about energy generation, and I mentioned earlier, oh, and I guess I could show on this chart too, that this is electricity up top. And I mentioned earlier that our reliance on electricity for a lot of applications to meet that 90 by 2050 goal that is our assigned target. In addition to reducing the amount that we use, we also really haven't been able to figure out how to do it without moving toward a lot more electrification. Electrification of both our vehicles, like I mentioned earlier, and really heating too. People have always said, you know, electric heat is bad, it's very inefficient. You know, now, you know, a lot of the new old technology with the so-called cold climate heat pumps are super efficient ways of using electricity to heat buildings. So there's a lot of emphasis on electrification going forward. And as a result, the total amount of energy that we will be using derived from electricity goes up over time. And this is just kind of a graph that shows the mix now, about here, and into the future with electricity generation.
So is that energy generation or electricity?
That's just electricity
Okay, because
generation.
it doesn't say that.
Right, I did a bunch of cropping and stuff here, so it counts on me to explain this well. Good question, though. Because, you know, solar, obviously, you know, I mean, if you've got a house that's oriented to the south with big windows, you're getting energy from solar. So, but this is talking specifically just about electricity generation from these resources. And over time, a few of the big trends that you notice is, yeah, I mean, nuclear has already dropped off quite a bit, but there's a baseline going forward of nuclear. And then when nuclear dropped off, we started picking up more regional generation from, outside Vermont. That was the Vermont Yankee thing. And so natural gas, the amount from natural gas is actually, increased. But obviously natural gas, as positive as a lot of folks are about natural gas and its prospects, it's still technically a non-renewable fuel, as is nuclear, by the way. And, and it still does contribute pretty significantly to greenhouse gas emissions, better than oil by most accounts. But so that share from natural gas goes down over time. And making up for that are a few things. Significant increases in the amount from wind, solar, and hydroelectricity. Now, Vermont doesn't have much additional capacity for hydroelectric, assuming we don't build any new dams, and that is an assumption we have been instructed to make, unless, Cynthia, you have an interest in building a dam on the Battenkill somewhere?
Not so much.
So most of this new hydroelectric, you see it just about doubles over time, is going to have to come from imported hydro. Right now we already get a big chunk of this hydro is imported, mostly from contracts from Hydro-Quebec. So a lot of new imported electricity, most of it from hydro, and then this increasing amount of wind and solar over time, most of which is in-state, but not all of it, but most of it. So the plans also, after we kind of take a look at where we are, take a look at the kinds of changes that would have to happen in our fuel mix over time, then it says, okay, think out some strategies, some ideas, some implementation steps of how we could actually move in that direction. What type of concrete actions can we take to move toward greater conservation and efficiency in heating and cooling buildings, and reducing our reliance on gas and diesel vehicles, and more efficient and developing more efficient land use and transportation systems? How can we continue to make progress in conserving electricity and in local distributed generation? Distributed generation is just the notion that you're generating electricity kind of within the area where you're using it, as opposed to generating electricity from, say, a power plant in Connecticut and bringing it up in a big transmission line that then feeds into the local distribution system. So this idea of local distributed generation is lots of smaller local generators within the distribution system, so you're not pulling it in through a big transmission pipeline, transmission lines. And then as part of those strategies related to electricity and the generation is to identify energy resources in areas that have the potential for renewable energy development. That map is just a cutout of a hydroelectric map in Bennington that shows the location of some existing dams with hydroelectric potential in Bennington. There aren't very many of those in our region. There's a few in Bennington. One is generating electricity now. There's one in Pownell, and then there's some of these smaller dams at places like Long Parent Creek. Anyway, that's just to explain what that is. My pre-programmed presentation has suggested this would be a good time to stop and ask if there's any questions on the first part. Okay. All right. So now into a little bit more detail on Act 174. So, as I mentioned, Act 174 deals with, citing the issues that we were talking about earlier about trying to give towns and regions a greater say in siting facilities, but it also, to get to that point, there's an expectation that you do some more thoughtful and thorough local and regional energy planning. So it establishes an optional set of planning standards. And this is not a required thing. This is nothing that towns have to do. It is something that regions have to do, as it turns out, but it's nothing that towns or villages have to do. You can develop these new municipal energy elements for your town and village plan or not. If you don't, you're right where you are now, which is you can expand. You can certainly write more things into your plan. You can amend your plan, update your plan. You don't have to follow these standards. If you don't, that's fine. Your plan is still good. It's valid. It has still the same effect at Act 250. It's still given consideration in Section 248 hearings for siting renewable energy facilities. But it doesn't get you quite the same status as if you did follow those standards. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So these standards were developed, they were required as part of Act 174 to be developed by the Department of Public Service, DPS, by November 1st of this year. They came out November 1st this year following a whole series of stakeholder meetings and meetings with transportation folks and space heating experts and electricity experts and mapping experts and renewable energy experts. So they brought all these folks in and tried to cook up a set of standards. Again, something that the department had never done before, entirely new to them. And so really just trying to create something that was effective and was something that people felt they could work with. Communities that meet the standards will receive a determination of energy compliance. And that is the latest phrase that it came up with because of a fear of saying things like an approved energy plan or something like that. So a determination of energy compliance basically means that your plan meets those standards. And it's, I guess the parenthetical note is that municipal plans have been evaluated for the last 20 years or so by regional planning commissions to determine if they contain all the required elements by statute and if they address all the planning goals. And that process doesn't change. That's a whole separate, different process that will continue to go on just as it has been without effect on this. So this is a separate process. Like I said, it's optional. And then if you get to that point as a municipality with your plan, then you move to the point where you have substantial deference in the Section 248 process, which is another great phrase that they came up with. At the present time, municipal plans and regional plans are given due consideration in the Section 248 process before the Public Service Board. And that's never really been defined, what due consideration means in the context of Public Service Board hearings. But it basically says that, that the board is supposed to consider, town and regional plans in the basket of things that they're thinking of when they're reviewing applications. And their criteria really are similar to the Act 250 criteria. In fact, they borrow directly from them in a lot of places. So they look at impacts on water quality and air quality and wildlife and soil erosion, all those types of things. But they also have this, it's called the Certificate of Public Good, so they're kind of balancing all the impacts against their assessment of the need that the public has for this particular project. So one of those things that they're considering is the town or the regional plan. So, and there's been that's where a lot of criticism historically has come from this thing, that the Public Service Board due consideration was pretty low, low bar for a lot of these plans, and that the boards were making decisions that appeared, at least to a lot of municipalities who were aggrieved by the decisions, of really not paying much attention to them or not giving them much weight. Yeah.
And is that the town plan and the local zoning, or just the town plan?
Just the plan.
Just the plan.
Just the plan. Yeah, it doesn't look at zoning. In fact, in Act 250, there was.
I thought it did. I thought Act 250 does.
Well, in Act 250, good question. Act 250 also looks at just the plan, but there is some case law guidance in Act 250 when there's some questions about what the plan means, that they can then go look at the land use regulations to get an idea or interpretation of what the intent of the plan is. That doesn't exist in 248, so they really just look at the plan. And at the same time, it's not like it has been totally ineffective. There have been cases where town plans maybe supported a project that was approved and they referenced them. There have been the rare case where a town plan was interpreted by the municipality as being suggesting that a project should not go forward, and the Public Service Board agreed and gave weight to the plan and turned down the project. Probably the famous case in our area is the so-called Chelsea Solar project in Bennington that Rick is familiar.
Apple Hill.
Well, there's two projects next to each other there. There's Chelsea and Apple Hill, and the board ruled that the project was inconsistent with the plan from a due consideration standpoint. So now, this notion of if a plan, it gets this determination of energy compliance, if you've done your proper energy, thoughtful, comprehensive energy planning, then the plan is elevated from due consideration to substantial deference. And substantial deference, they didn't attempt to make a definition that, and that's what it is. You read it, that a land conservation measure, specific policy, shall be applied in accordance with its terms unless there is a clear and convincing demonstration that other factors affecting the general good of the state outweigh the application of the measure or policy. And some people would note that the unless part is significantly longer than the first part there, which gives them an out, right? But I think that a couple really important things to take away from this is one is you're looking at land conservation measures. So the idea is that if there's something in the plan that says there's a really important land conservation objective, and here's a good rational basis for it expressed in our plan. It's not like you can just say, we don't like solar projects, we don't like the way they look. I mean, maybe you can say that, but there's a good chance that would carry the day. That they're really looking for land conservation measures. Why are you concerned about conserving this particular type of land or this specific piece of property or this particular hillside or mountaintop or open field or whatever? What are your conservation objectives for that area? And as long as they generally apply, then the board should give them substantial deference. And I would say the other part of this thing is that this legislation came out of a lot of concern around the state, and there's a lot of expectations going along with it that it's going to have an effect. So I think the Public Service Board probably can't speak for the Public Service Board, but I think that they probably recognize if they go about business as usual with plans that have this determination of energy compliance, that it's probably not going to go down well. Let's say I think there's political considerations as well. Standard of review. So municipalities have to do these plans. We'll talk about what has to go into these plans in more detail in a moment. But what is it that is considered when someone is deciding? We'll tell you who's deciding that the plans are up to snuff, that they meet the standards to get a determination of energy compliance. Well, you start out with the statutory goal, which is the same goal that we look at for approving town plans at the Regional Planning Commission level. And that's just this general overview statement about does the town plan address things in a meaningful way about energy conservation, energy efficiency across different sectors, electric, heat, and transportation, as well as thinking about renewable energy generation. And then there's also some new language about specific strategies and recommendations, and there's some guidance and direction given on those. But those are really, if you look at the annotated municipal plan standards I gave out, then you get an idea of the flavor of those types of specific strategies and recommendations. Then this is an important one too. When the plan's being evaluated, municipal plans have lots of pieces to them. Most of you know that. So it'll have an introduction and a statement of goals and objectives, and it'll have a land use section and an economic development section and a flood resilience section and natural resource protection and a historic preservation, transportation, public utilities, and an energy section. And the law basically says when the plan's being evaluated, you look at the whole plan. So you don't look at just the energy piece. You have to make sure that the plans are internally consistent, so that the energy section, if the energy section says that, a good thing to do in the town would be to support compact mixed-use development in its village centers and develop the supporting infrastructure to allow that to happen. And then the land use part has all these, strip commercial zones everywhere that I was making something up, that it kind of promotes or encourages or facilitates, kind of sprawling development around the countryside. And then you might say, well, the energy element, see, they seem to be thinking about that there, but they weren't really thinking about it in the land use section. So that's, I don't know if it's ever going to be black and white, but the idea is to really make sure that the different pieces of the plan fit together. And probably the two obvious ones are the land use and the transportation sections of the plan. Maybe the housing to an extent too. But certainly transportation is our biggest energy user of all the sectors, more than anything else. So the transportation section is going to be a big piece of the plan too. So basic requirements of the municipal energy plans. First one is they need to be adopted. So you have to go through the adoption process in your municipality, make sure that the plan is legally adopted, and then go through the aforementioned approval process by the Regional Planning Commission, which all of our towns and villages historically have done, submit their plans to the Regional Planning Commission. Other than a couple that have been delayed to get a couple missing elements in them, none of them have ever not been approved. So you have to get that. So your plan needs to be approved. And again, the Regional Planning Commission certainly can approve a town plan under Section 4302, so you can have that traditional regional approval without having the plan be up to standards on the energy side. So, but that has to happen first. And then it has to have an energy plan, and that energy plan can be, an expansion of the existing energy chapter in your plan, or it could be a standalone energy plan document that's formally incorporated by reference in the plan. Like Bennington has a town energy plan. It's probably like 60 pages long. It's pretty detailed. It has all sorts of specific recommendations and has a lot of the data that's called for, and the lot's already kind of like done. So in Bennington's case, and Dorset has a report that has a lot of the same information, they may very well decide to just kind of beef up that piece and not, kind of go back to work on the internal part of the plan.
But Jim?
Yeah.
But the other, if it's separate, the plan has to also be updated to coincide with what's...
Well, yeah. I mean, I have to say, exactly. I mean, I have to say that, yeah, you would have to at least update the plan to make a specific link
whatever,
between
in each
them.
sector.
Well, I think that you would probably, in your energy chapter of your town plan, have to say that, the town energy plan dated XYZ, is to be considered as a part of this plan and is adopted along with this plan. The question of updating the other sections, the land use and the transportation section, I think that you at least need to give a careful reading of those to make sure that they're consistent with that plan. I don't. In most of the cases, honestly, in our region, the towns, by and large, their land use plans and their transportation plans really are pretty consistent. They may be a little bit general, and your energy plan might want to be more specific, but we don't really have any, plans that I would consider to be, really out of sync with the energy planning standards as far as the land use and transportation stuff goes. So key components of the plan, same as what I went over for the regional plan, really. Analysis and targets. Analysis is just kind of an analysis of current energy use, and targets is like what the energy mix picture is going to look like in the future. That may sound like a big reach, but as I'll explain in a minute, it's not really too bad because the regional planning commissions are supposed to give you all that information. And then pathways. So what are those implementation actions? What are specific steps that you can think of that might work in your community to make progress toward those goals? How can you encourage, more energy efficient homes and conversions to alternative heating systems, for example. Again, then the one that gets, excuse me, a lot of attention, siting considerations and mapping. So the plan needs to have something in there that talks about, you know, where are suitable and unsuitable locations for renewable energy development.
Are those listed on one of the handouts?
Yes, yes, they are. In fact, there's kind of like big section headings on those municipal standards, and they're more or less aligned with those: analysis and targets, pathways,
Oh, okay.
and mapping. But there's lots of bullet points under those. Questions on this piece?
And doesn't the zoning will then have to follow the town plan? I mean, they're pretty major changes if you're,
The zoning, there may be, you may find, depending on what your recommendations are in your plan, that to fully and effectively implement those recommendations, you would want to make some changes to your zoning. You know, a town might say, but of course it's complicated, right? As we know, in places like Dorset and Shaftesbury and Arlington and Rupert, is like you might say that you want to encourage more development in your historic centers, and like higher density and mixed use development. That might start to bump into some other municipal objectives, but leaving that aside for the moment, there's some real infrastructure challenges too, right?
like sewer.
Water and sewer
yeah.
availability. You know,
It
so
doesn't exist.
so it's like it's not like anybody's is an expectation that towns are going to make this happen. You know, that all of a sudden, you know, that Dorset's going to have a municipal sewer system, right? But you know, it's the kind of thing say that you need to kind of identify what those issues are and maybe pathways forward to dealing with some alternative ideas for addressing them. May not be a municipal sewer system, but there's technical assistance programs available through the Department of Environmental Conservation that are designed to help towns that don't have sewer systems deal with those. And I just heard a good interview with the new Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources today, and she really seemed very well versed in talking about exactly that. You know, how do we help these towns with non-existent or deficient water and sewer systems? You know, come up with some innovative solutions so they can support the kind of development that they want.
And that was a VPR
Yeah.
interview. Yeah, if anybody wants to listen to it, it's Julie Moore. It's on Vermont Edition, and you can go there and you can listen to it on your computer.
Thank you.
Julie
Julie
Moore,
Moore.
Vermont Edition on VPR.
Yeah, the Agency of Natural Resources is a huge and diverse agency, and the secretaries usually come from a particular interest area expertise. I mean, because of the strong interest in the state right now in water quality in Lake Champlain, she's really a water quality expert, and her working in water quality is certainly overlapped very heavily with a lot of those municipal infrastructure issues. So it's nice that somebody's coming in with that kind of expertise and focus. So I go through really quickly these pieces of the plan. So the plans have to contain an analysis of the following across all energy sectors: resources needs, scarcities, costs, problems for electricity, thermal, which is kind of heating and cooling buildings and water, and transportation. So, where does it come from now? How much of it do you use? How much are you going to need in the future? What types of limitations might you be facing? How much is how much are you spending on this stuff, and what does the future look like? What are the issues? What are the problems going forward that you see? Again, the Department of Public Service has some guidance available on their website that's currently being refined. Right now, it's pretty opaque document, I say. But the intention is that it's going to be refined and made a lot more readable and understandable going forward, and very user-friendly, I would say. So how you can come up with some of these estimates and analyses. Better yet, perhaps, I mean, depending on your interest, is, right now in our regional energy plan, in the appendix and the data that underlies the appendix, we have already town-level estimates of current energy use across all those sectors. And we have the ability, as I will show you in a minute, to help towns do some future projections for energy use across different sectors. In fact, we have to do that by the end of April. So whether you want to use them or not is entirely up to you, but we have to produce those estimates and projections for all the towns in our region. Catherine's going to do that. So, yeah, this is what we have now, for example. So that's just a graphic from our plan for one of the towns, for Sunderland. It just gives some information on the types of households there are, the types of businesses and the number of businesses, the number of vehicles in Sunderland, and then how the buildings are heated and how much fuel is used for transportation. The only thing that we know for sure is, let's see if I can. I don't have that. That's my favorite slide. The only thing we know for sure is electricity use. That number we get directly from the utility, so we know exactly what that is by residential and commercial use. And then, again, next step is establishing targets. So, how does your town want to move toward those energy goals that the state has, both in terms of, thermal. You made projections. You might say, well, our town, we live in the middle of the forest. There's a lot of loggers, and there's a lot of loggers who like more work, and there's a potential for really boosting our heating with cordwood, and so maybe the town wants to go heavily in that direction and try to find ways to support or encourage that. Maybe other towns might want to put much more emphasis on, well, let's work with the oil dealers and figure out a way to help them kind of become more in the way of energy service providers. Instead of just selling oil, maybe they can sell weatherization services. Maybe they can sell alternative types of boilers. So maybe there's a strategy there. Maybe a town says, we love the idea of these super efficient cold climate heat pumps. So let's reach out to Green Mountain Power and see what kind of programs there are, and maybe we can do some educational programs in our community about getting people to use more of these heat pumps. So there's no one answer. It's what a town wants to put in their plan. And then there's this electric generation too. It's like, what are the reasonable targets for electricity generation within your community, kind of based on what the expectation is for the state and the region. We'll talk more about that. And then evaluate the needs and changes that occur over time. So we just talked about, and then my favorite slide. And my favorite slide because that's the cover of my favorite book, in case you don't know. And I didn't even make that slide.
You don't have the screen? You don't have that?
No, I don't have the screen. I don't have the screen. But when things are really bad, you go back to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and you don't. So again, regional planning commissions, we have a lot of this data that was developed as part of our regional plan. It can certainly be customized, for your municipality. Working with you, we can do that, and we have to, at the very least, provide you with three things. We have to provide you with estimates of current energy use across all sectors. We have to provide you with some kind of baseline document for targets and projections that you can tweak locally, and we have to provide you with some energy resource base maps for you to start working with. So those will all be given to you to use if you want them. You don't have to take them, but we have to make them according to our agreement with the state. So, yeah, so this kind of goes over what I just said, really. So this is just some real quick examples, and I won't go through it all in great detail, but how do we go about estimating, how much transportation fuel is used? So in the case of Shaftesbury, we go to this document called the American Community Survey that is a census effort to get all sorts of interesting information from each community about the way people, how many of all sorts of things there are, basically. How many households, how many cars, how many people working here, how many people working there, the whole range of things you might get in the census. But they update that on a regular basis between the 10-year census. So from that we can get an estimate of about how many household vehicles there are in a town like Shaftesbury. It turns out like 2,930. We know in a community like Shaftesbury, again, this is estimates and assumptions, that there's a range in Vermont of like between 10 and 15,000 miles per year of driving. So in a town like Bennington, maybe there would be a little bit less because people maybe, have more employment and shopping locally. In Shaftesbury, maybe the folks out in East Shaftesbury have to drive a little bit further. So we just use the 14,000 per car. You get a number of miles, you divide it by a generous estimate for miles per gallon, you get the number of gallons used, you can estimate based on current fuel costs what the amount of money that Shaftesbury spends on gasoline is. You can figure out, if you want to, how much of that might be ethanol, if there's any use for that. There's even a little algorithm for estimating how much diesel fuel there might be based on the total amount. Number of electric vehicles. Right now, there's not a lot of electric vehicles in the region, but the state does track electric vehicle registrations, so you can find out how many electric vehicles there are. I think there's 12 in Bennington County now.
But there are hybrids too.
Yeah, there's hybrids. It doesn't include hybrids, but it does include plug-in hybrids. So anything that...
Because that saves something, I mean, that...
Yeah.
Oh yeah. No question about it. I mean, what hybrids do, traditional non-plug-in hybrids especially, is that they boost that number.
Right.
So by boosting that number, they
Right.
reduce that number.
Right, got it.
So,
Do you deal with through traffic?
well, that's a really good one because we don't have a great way to get any of this stuff, but we really don't have a great way to figure out how many people are just driving through from somewhere else
Well,
and maybe buying their gas here. We don't even have any way of figuring out how much gas is pumped at local gas stations. So we don't have a really good way of doing that. But what we do is a lot of communities where they do see a lot of through traffic, or especially a lot of like destination resort communities where people come in. There's no expectation that they'll try that those towns will actually measure or try to quantify the amount of gasoline that's used to drive to or from those places or through those places. But the plan should note that is something that happens, and that's an issue for the town to think about. And if a destination like a ski area, let's say, that relies very, very heavily on people driving to the ski area, say, if we really want to move the ball in the right direction, how do we create opportunities for alternative ways? Because we don't want people to stop coming by any stretch of the imagination if gas prices, go up a lot like they are prone to do over time. So how do we make this? So is there, what can we do cooperatively or think about in the way of, rail transportation or public transportation or things like that? So I mean, it's not perfect, but it's again, I think, to me, the whole thing with this and all the data and the targets and everything else is really just to get towns to think and talk about these energy issues. It's not, nobody's saying, you're wrong. You didn't spend $3.7 million. You spent $3.3 million on gas. I mean, it's really just to kind of get you thinking about the order of magnitude and the kinds of shifts and changes you might be talking about over time. So this is taken from a plan. There's a whole 6-step process, here and here. that walks you through how to estimate the amount of different types of fuel used to heat homes in your town. So you know like how many total housing units there are, you know how many owner occupied, how many renter occupied units there are. There's some certain assumptions baked into those about the occupancy and the size of those that you can use to translate to estimate of square footage per dwelling unit, and then there's some pretty reasonable estimates on the energy usage per square foot in a unit, and then you can translate that into units for each one of the different fuel sources. So it's not perfect, it's not an exact measure, but at least it's based on something. It's based on ACS data on the actual mix of fuel sources in your town and the actual number of housing units in your town. So again, it's not perfect, it's not exact, but it gives you a pretty good idea of where you are now. And as I mentioned, the electricity stuff, at least that's something that we know because that's a regulated utility, so they keep track of all of that. This is at a zip code level, which is all we had access to when we did our regional plan, but they've refined it, I think, now to a town level, so you can find town by town how much electricity is used for both for business uses and for residential uses. And then this is a really tricky part now because we're really projecting the future. It goes back to those graph that I had earlier that showed shrinking and really shrinking the fossil fuel use. So this is just looking at one of those sectors. So that modeling, that LEAP modeling, is all broken down sector by sector. It's broken down by residential, commercial, industrial, transportation total. So this is just looking at residential. And it shows that significant decrease over in time and the shift in the units. And this is all expressed in million BTUs, which no one really knows what a million BTU looks like. So we just convert that over into things that people are used to dealing with, like well, there's an intermediate step where we say how many kilowatt hours of electricity, how many gallons of oil, how many gallons of LPG or propane gas, how many cords of cordwood or tons of cordwood, and how many tons of wood pellets you use. And then we translate that to the number of households heated with each of those fuel sources. Again, this is based on the LEAP model, and the number of household units in Shaftesbury, just kind of taking the regional totals and transferring it to the town level. Nobody expects this to be perfect, but what it basically does is say, okay, if we're buying into that regional modeling, this is how things might change in Shaftesbury over time. So biodistillates is like biodiesel fuel, or oil made from crops, oilseed crops or algae or things like that. There's significant assumptions built in here about technological advances. In my estimation, probably unrealistic. So a town might say, we think this is really unrealistic that 386 of our houses are going to be heated primarily with liquid biofuels. So let's take a lot of those numbers away and put it into wood pellets, which we already have and know, and we can support local production of wood pellets, for example. Or maybe you want to just same type of thing. Number of houses heated with cordwood, electric resistance goes down over time. Note that the heat pump estimate goes way up. Nobody's been able to figure out yet how to make this 90 by 50 thing work without doing something like that. Where the electricity comes from is a whole other thing. Maybe it comes from local sources, maybe it's all imported, but significant growth in the number of heat pumps. Kerosene is a non-renewable fuel, oil as well. Propane is non-renewable, but it's pretty efficient, so they kept some of that in the mix. Again, that's something that towns can take a look at the base table that we give them and play around with the numbers. What do you think? But anyway, it gives you an idea of the kind of changes that would have to happen over time if you buy into this model. Questions on that part before I get to the last and fun part? Yeah.
So if a town was doing what you just had up there with the example of Shaftesbury, this would involve putting these pathways and targets in the plan and then following through with like outreach to the community, or say you have to use this heat pump and connect with, I mean, I think one of the things that I'm concerned about is that it seems to imply at least the promise of much more proactive involvement by the town in individual homeowners' decisions about how to run their lives. Now, maybe it's just a question of giving people pamphlets or making them aware of tax credits or, you know, whatever, but I find that, I mean, that makes me very uncomfortable. I mean, I support the general direction and the general kinds of things that are being discussed here, but it really is very different from someone having to get a permit to build a garage to having the town reaching out to everybody and saying you got to switch to heat pumps.
Well,
or is it just you put it in your plan and then you don't do anything? I mean,
well, there's something intermediate, I think. I spent a fair bit of time explaining to the Public Service Department what towns and town plans can and cannot do. And one thing towns and town plans cannot do clearly is make anything happen at the individual level. They can certainly make things happen, if you will, at a municipal level. Say the town plan could have a statement that says the town shall adopt a capital improvement plan, and that capital improvement plan should include
solar panels on the roof.
Solar panels on the roof, or weatherization of the town office building. But you absolutely cannot do that with an individual home or business. So what the plan can do is support educational programs, outreach, talk about inviting NeighborWorks of Western Vermont to come down and do a workshop and get information out to folks on weatherization programs, things like that. You try to cooperate with the Regional Planning Commission, in supporting forums for fuel oil dealers to try to get them more information on diversifying their businesses, things like that. But yeah, you can't say that the town of Shaftesbury will require 343 homeowners to switch to heat pumps. You just can't do that. And not in this country, certainly not in this state. So, that's an important point, and it's one I think that wasn't really obvious to a lot of the folks at the state when they started developing these standards. They thought that plans could maybe be a little bit more prescriptive than they really can be.
Yeah, I think you have to be careful about people perceiving that as an endorsement of something, because if something does go wrong down the line.
Well, that's a really good point, and one of the things that still happens on a regular basis, was 5 and now 8 years, is your plans get updated. So 8 years ago, I'm going to tell you, as far as I know, even though they existed, nobody was talking about heat pumps, right? I mean, nobody. I didn't hear about them. And then all of a sudden, now that's all anybody can talk about. So there's, new technology and new ideas. It may be that those prove to be too expensive or impractical, or the whole electricity thing isn't working out. And so, 8 years from now, you've learned a lesson and you go in a different direction. And with suggesting and supporting some different goals, but it's a good point, and I think that the point that you make that's really important is to get the folks who might be reading these plans to understand that these are plans. They're not requirements. So, but that's because you're right. I mean, most people don't have any idea really what a town plan is or what it's for. So we need to make sure that people understand the whole picture. Chris, do you have a question?
Well, Cynthia sort of asked that same question.
Yeah.
We had this discussion at the Shaftesbury Planning Commission on Tuesday, and it all comes back down to, well, what can we really do at our level that would be effective in our community?
Yeah.
And so, I don't know, I'm still reaching around to try and answer that.
Well, I could say, I think one of the reasons that this whole Act 174 thing came about with its emphasis on kind of local and regional planning is because a lot of stuff hasn't worked before. Yeah, I mean, how many times have we gone out and tried to do, weatherization programs? They've had some success, but they really haven't had the kind of reach that would really be effective. So I think the idea is like, well, let's put this into a system that really supports widespread planning and outreach on all these things. And maybe we'll start, increasing the awareness and educational component so that some of this, and generating some new ideas. If everybody's thinking about this stuff, we'll come up with some new ideas. One thing is, you mentioned maybe putting solar panels on the roof of the town office building or town garage. Well, there's actually a provision in the standards about that it's a good idea for towns to try to lead by example. So if you do something like that and say the town is saving $10,000 a year in net in electricity costs by doing this project, find out how you can save at least a few $100s a year in your own home by doing something similar. So I mean, that kind of thing. It's there's no one magic bullet, and there's no right answer. So pathways and targets really quickly. So this is just exactly what we're talking about. The pathways and recommended actions. There's some ideas that are in the annotated version of the standards that you've got. There's going to be a whole document coming out from the Public Service Department that kind of gives more examples of possible ideas for your towns. And then the plans should also have statements of policy, and I'm sure that most all of your plans already have statements of policies on energy conservation and efficiency. That's what most town energy plans have historically been, just that. And then transportation and land use. And again, I think that we're in pretty good shape on those things. This is one where a lot of the plans haven't had really specific language on development and siting of renewable energy resources. And some actions may not be applicable or relevant to every town. Somebody that's talking about, concentrated mixed-use development in Sandgate, for example, that doesn't really have a whole lot of meaning in a town like Sandgate, because you're probably never going to have a really compact village center in Sandgate, but, other things are relevant to Sandgate. This is just from the regional plan. It just kind of goes through, here's a list of thermal strategies. So the regional plan has like 3 or 4 pages on thermal strategies. For each one of these little items has a little, block out that talks about, education and incentives, enforcement of building energy standards, heat pumps, biomass district heating systems in places where it would work, like apartment buildings and stuff like that. You can do outreach to, we had a really good session in Bennington earlier this year with some of the larger landlords, talking with them and walking them through how they can weatherize their buildings and do fairly simple, straightforward energy efficiency improvements. Because in Bennington, 40% of the housing stock is rentals, and most of that is the worst performing from an energy perspective. So just getting 5 or 6 of the biggest landlords together and walking through all the available programs and some of the simple solutions, I think that's the kind of thing that could make a big difference. So those are the kind of things for strategies. Now mapping. The mapping part, that's what everybody kind of focuses on, because that we start talking about the renewable energy resources and the siting stuff. And we're still kind of back and forthing a little bit with the state on what the final maps are going to look like. But we have to do maps for biomass, which is basically wood, and hydroelectric, which is kind of where the existing dams are. Those are fairly straightforward maps. It just kind of gives us an estimate of how much potential we have for biomass heating in the region. And the hydro just gives us an estimate for about how much hydroelectric generation potential we have at existing dams. The more interesting and challenging stuff is the solar and wind resources, because those resources are more ubiquitous, and they also have more potential to conflict with existing land uses and natural resources and community values. So there's an effort made to at least provide a good basis and understanding for where the resources are and where the environmental constraints are. So we start out with a map. I'll go through it a little bit, but this is what kind of like a final output map looks like. It shows places where there's relatively good access to solar energy, and where there's solar energy, that's where the sun shines pretty regularly based on topographic conditions. But there also are environmental constraints of one order of magnitude or another. And so it kind of screens them all out, and these different color codes kind of say how severe the environmental constraints are to development at a level of statewide modeling, I have to say. So I want to just talk about that a little bit more. So again, we start out with maps that just where does the sun shine, where does the wind blow most reliably, where's the wood, where are the dams, where is the renewable energy resources. That's the underlying part of the maps. And then we drop on top of those things constraints, and the standards refer to them as known and possible constraints. The known constraints are really critical environmental resources that the Agency of Natural Resources has identified as places where you're really not going to be doing any kind of development, let alone renewable energy development. They're class 1 and 2 wetlands and river corridors and rare and irreplaceable natural areas, and things that are just off limits to development. So we just drop those out of the picture altogether. Then there's a category that they've identified as possible constraints, and those are things that certainly could complicate development, but don't necessarily absolutely preclude it from an environmental standpoint. So they're like lower class wetlands and special flood hazard areas, not river corridor areas, prime agricultural soils, things like that. So they don't absolutely preclude development, but they might. So there are things to think about when you're doing it. And that gives us like a, sorry for the fuzziness of this one, but that gives us an overall map. Yep.
When you're saying this says we're not going to development or something might preclude development, who's making that judgment? Who's saying, well, this might preclude development or it might not? Or who's saying this absolutely I understand the examples you gave,
Yep.
but there are more issues than just those examples.
Yes.
So who's making that determination?
Okay, so that's a two-tiered thing, maybe three. Okay, so the first order is those constraints that I mentioned, plus they're all listed in the standards.
Okay.
Those are things that were given to us by the state, primarily the Agency of Natural Resources, but also a couple other state agencies like agriculture. So those are things that we have to include in our maps, and municipalities have to include in their maps. Okay. Now, next level, in like our regional plan maps, so we can add more or different constraints or opportunities. We could say, let's include on our maps, or at least as a narrative to go along with our map, where are really good places for preferred locations for energy development, like old landfills or gravel pits or large rooftops, things like that. And we actually have a big list of them in our plan, places that would seem to make sense. We can also put in things that should be off limits for development. We wanted to kind of hand that down to the town level, so the only thing that we really put in there, we kind of flagged the prime ag soils, not as being things that you shouldn't develop, but things that the Regional Planning Commission, that you should really pay special attention to those prime ag soils. And also, specifically identified like preservation districts in towns speaking specifically of like scenic resource protection and historic preservation districts and design review districts and things like that. That's the second level. The third level is the municipal level. So this is like what Shaftesbury might look like in a fuzzy sort of way, just going through the first two steps. You know, it kind of where does the sun shine and where are the constraints. These darker blobs are where there aren't any identified environmental constraints, and the grayish blobs are where there's prime ag soil. But in all the colored spots, there's pretty good access to solar energy. Yeah.
What if that red area, suppose that big red area right under the FTS, what if that was a deer wintering yard? And I'm just making this up, I don't know that it is, but suppose it was, and that was actually protected in Shaftesbury's town plan, that you're not supposed to develop in the deer wintering area, facing south, you know, it's got hemlocks or whatever it's got. How would that be viewed in this process in terms of if Shaftesbury said, we can't allow this here, what would the regional or the state levels?
It's a good question. So, I mean, in that specific example, it would be, because that is one of the state constraints that we're given, deer wintering areas, but there might be other.
But
ones.
the state does not necessarily identify everything that towns do.
Right. So there's two really good points that raises. One is that the maps aren't going to be perfectly accurate, right? Just because of the nature of mapping and geographic data. So, you know, there's one example of there's a solar project proposed down in Pownell that our maps show as being on prime ag land, and we go down and take a look at it, and it's an old gravel pit, and there's nothing but gravel there. There may have been prime agricultural soil on top of the gravel at one point. So what's really important is kind of the
Field test.
process and the things that you're looking at, more than the map. The map is kind of a planning illustration of the process. The other thing you raise is, there might be critical natural resources that the town knows about, that the state doesn't know about, or is a higher priority in the town than the state. And that is our hope and expectation, is that the towns will take those. So if Shaftesbury knows of an important natural resource right there, or a critical viewshed for the town that you don't want disrupted by development, then Shaftesbury, take this map that we cut out and give to you, and you mark it up and put those resources on it. And that's what this is about. So, you know, locally you can identify preferred locations. So, you know, maybe Arlington might have identified the roof of the school, you know, which would have been good, because you just put solar panels on the roof of the school. Or maybe there's some municipally owned land that would make a good location for a solar project. And so you put that in your plan and say that's a preferred location, even though it's located, you know, on a nice open field that's otherwise, you know, good for agriculture, whatever. We really think that we want a solar project there. Put it on your plan, put it in your map. Unsuitable areas, you know, areas in particular where the town does not want to see solar, or does not want to see wind, maybe does not want to see clear cutting, although that's a little bit harder because that runs into some other state regulations. But the only catch on that's in this law is that if you're gonna say something like there's a, you know, if you want to say no solar development in any open fields in Shaftesbury, right? Then your plan needs to explain why. You know, is it because of the aesthetic concern, or you don't want to see development in those beautiful open fields? Perfectly good and valid reason for the town to X those off, except if the concern is about not having development on those, the law says you need to treat other types of land development the same way. So if you allow 1 acre subdivision lots there, you know, it's inconsistent from the law's perspective, it's inconsistent. So it's not saying you can't allow residential development there, but you need to have some type of language in your plan that says if you're going to develop residential in these scenic fields that we're so concerned about maintaining the character, it needs to be done in a way that preserves the scenic attributes of the field. So it needs to be clustered, the building envelopes have to be defined in a way that preserves some of that open space resource that we're so concerned about. So that's a bit tricky, but that's something that they wrote into the legislation that says you can certainly do that, but you kind of have to treat all of your development constraints have to be kind of based on a single objective. So, let me see. So, this is, yeah, Chris.
Well, like I said, the other night, we talked about this for a long time in Shaftesbury Planning Commission, and one of the things that came up was, well, where does this fit into zoning? And not that this is zoning, but the purpose of zoning, as is usually stated, is that it's to protect public health and safety and guarantee or promote the orderly development of community. And so when people say, well, I don't like solar panels because I don't like the glare that comes off them, then people say, well, really the objection is aesthetic. It's not what solar panels do, it's not how they affect the land, it's just they don't want to look at them.
Right.
So I say, well, does aesthetics actually fit into those categories that are the purpose of zoning? And I think aesthetics is way out on the outer edge.
Well,
Which is not to discount it, but
it can be. I mean, like I said, there certainly are ways to regulate aesthetics. I mean, there's, we talked about it at the Shaftesbury Planning Commission. I mean, you can have the hillside protection ordinances, you can have design control districts. I mean,
yeah, Shaftesbury would never vote for any of those things.
Right.
But if they said aesthetics, that we don't want to look at solar panels, that might get some support. Design review district, forget about it.
Right. It might. That might be one of the places where you run into. I mean, actually, Shaftesbury has some pretty progressive language in the subdivision regulations. So, if you're talking about subdivision, about mandating, kind of planned residential development. So, I mean, that's actually, a pretty good regulatory tool when it comes to aesthetics. It's not just about aesthetics; it's about efficiency too. But it's at least it's addressing that, and it's talking about preserving open fields and agricultural land and stuff like that. So, yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where you can't say, according to this, that you don't mind the look of a parking lot in a Dollar General store. You don't mind that so much, that's okay, but solar panels, ick. So you couldn't put solar panels where you're gonna, allow a Dollar General with a parking lot. Not to pick on Dollar General, which is a perfectly good store, but there just has to be some nexus in the plan between the land conservation measures that you're using to say that solar development or wind development isn't appropriate in an area and the land conservation objective. Yeah.
I think the other thing about zoning is that it's, when we talk about orderly development, it gives a landowner a certain expectation as to what is going to happen around them. If you're in the rural residential district, you do not expect to have an industrial facility located next door. I don't have the aesthetic problems with the solar panels that some people have, but there may be other issues, and I have big problems with the industrial wind. And so I think one of the big problems for me about this whole context with this Act 248 preemption of local zoning, the whole idea of zoning is to give you some certainty, some confidence that you can expect what's going to go on around you. And this makes it that you have no such confidence. You could have an industrial facility next door to you, whether it's wind or solar, and we know what's zoned industrial in Arlington and in Shaftesbury, and we know what's zoned commercial. But this siting doesn't pay attention to any of that. That's the problem. That's the problem with this whole process, and I think Jim is doing
Oh,
a great.
wait. To characterize solar as industrial is really a reach, in my opinion.
I mean, it is, it's, then call it an electrical facility, electrical generating facility, call it anything you want. It's not, I'm not for or against the solar, I'm just telling you that one of the things to me that zoning is about is that you have an expectation. A landowner, when you buy in a certain district, you have some expectation about what can go next to you. When they were upset about the Dollar General going down in that area, it was already zoned commercial. They should have had an expectation that that was going to be commercial, you know.
All right,
So I
so
think,
let me give you an example of my own personal experience
Yeah.
with this. I have a wilderness camp in northern Vermont, which I've been working on for the last 50 years. This is in the middle of Essex County, the middle of nowhere. And when I look out from my front deck at night, I see the red blinking lights of the Sheffield wind turbines on my horizon. Now, I didn't have any say in that, and I'm not real thrilled about it, but at the same time, I recognize that there was a process, the process was followed, and that was the result, and that electricity is being generated over there, and everybody's electricity has to come from somewhere.
oh yeah, and I get that, but my point is only that the way things are structured with the Public Service Board controlling the siting of these things, the process that it went through did not involve local zoning. So some people are now next to those windmills, and they had no expectation when they bought their property that that would ever happen, because it was not zoned industrial, it was not zoned for
Yeah,
electricity.
not only that, there's not even zoning in that part of the country.
And there you go. And so, you know, so which makes it even more complicated. But that's the whole problem with it. And I think one of the things that everybody's trying to struggle is, how do you balance those different kinds of things? Does the state say that the climate change, you know, the prevention of climate change and saving the emissions and the electricity, that goal is important enough so that we're gonna destroy prime ag or use prime ag in a certain way, or blast off the hilltops as they probably did at Sheffield, you know? So how do you balance those things? And I think that my problem is, I don't think the state has the right balancing process, because even with this substantial deference, they're only going to give deference to your plan if you're doing everything that they want. So that's like a circular definition. They're not really deferring to your desires. If they would defer to your zoning. Arlington says you can't build above 1,200 feet. Nothing. And yet, it's quite possible that the Public Service Board could site industrial windmills above 1,200 feet. So I think that's wrong, you know, and that's my problem in terms of the legislature or anything. But I just think what you're bringing out is all these questions of, how do you struggle with that balance? And if you guys are part of planning commissions or town boards, and you're going to try to do this and take it back to the people, you are going to hear from property owners who are going to say, wait a minute, that is not what I expected. You're identifying this plot next to me as prime this or prime that. You just damaged my property value. You know, it is going to be a mess. Now, I think we have to look at it anyway, but you just need to have your eyes open.
I mean, I think, you know, you kind of got to the crux of it, didn't you? I mean, you know, the Section 248 process is different than the Act 250 process, you know, and there's two separate processes, and the state
Yeah,
proceeds.
but that's not in the Bible. It doesn't have to.
Or it doesn't have to be, but at the moment, that's the way it is.
That's right.
And you know, Act 250 and local zoning gives, you know, greater consideration to those specific land use districts kind of things. I think that this law is an attempt to kind of find a middle ground that a lot of people are not going to be happy with, because they think that one side is right and the other side is right. And this is basically trying to say, okay, towns, we understand that there's places you really don't want this. There's places maybe where you do. So here's an opportunity to make a plan that explains your rationale for why you don't want it in certain places and why it's okay in other places. What the spoken or unspoken word is that, you know, a town maybe can't say that they don't want it anywhere. You know, that there has to be some provision for it somewhere. And the question then becomes, you know, how much? you
Yeah,
know?
but what if all of the industrial windmill sites are in fact in important natural resource areas in a town? There's no wind site that isn't in an important natural area.
Right, so let me take that in a couple of steps. One is, you know, there's only, you know, if you remember that electricity generation chart I showed that had more hydro, more solar,
Yeah,
more
yeah.
wind, right? There's an expectation that there'd be a certain amount of that statewide over time, but not an unlimited amount of that over time. And likewise, we're trying to figure out with the department how to reasonably set targets for, you know, regional levels of.
I mean,
of
could you have more
wind.
solar if you're not gonna have wind, or do more
Yeah.
efficiency?
It-
I mean,
it's-
do they let you substitute?
Actually, it's baked right into the
The
standards.
substitution,
Yep, it says, so if Bennington County
okay.
doesn't want any wind, not that it's good. If they don't, then you can go a low wind scenario and have a whole lot more solar. I
Okay,
mean, there's some problems
right,
with that from a practical standpoint, because solar panels don't do particularly well at certain times of the year and at certain
Right.
times of the day. And, you know, you have to balance the electric load. So if everybody said that, it might cause problem. You know, but there's also a recognition that the resources and both the energy resources and the environmental resources are going to be different in different places. So nobody is going to expect that everybody has, you know, the same amount of wind, or that every town in Bennington County has some wind energy generation. I mean, our estimates based on the statewide total, if you were to allocate a share of that to Bennington County, is that there'd be like between 20 and 30 megawatts of wind energy over the next 35 years in Bennington County, which is like one fair-sized wind project, which would be probably in one place, or maybe there would be two smaller ones. It's not going to be everywhere. If we had one in the next 35 years, I'd be a little surprised. If we had two, I would be absolutely amazed. You know, so so I think it's really important that the planning goes on. It really tries to identify, you know, the resources that we're trying to protect, and maybe trying to find some places where it would be less impactful if that one project does come along. Solar is different. Solar is a lot more ubiquitous. I mean, it's you know, the sun shines almost everywhere in Bennington County. In some places better than in other places. So there's a lot more intersections with solar and various resources and where people live and everything else. So you know, this is just, you know, to kind of illustrate that really quickly. This is just another cutout map of Manchester, just picking like 3 things that a town could do to mark up a map, and there could be 100 things like this on the map. You know, this is a gravel pit that's for sale in Manchester that would actually be locationally an ideal spot for a solar project. I understand it's a little bit pricey, so it might be out of reach for that. But the towns could put that on the map as saying that's a preferred location. Yeah.
Is there any way that if there's like a place that you really didn't want developed, how to take it off the map?
That's this X down here. So
Oh, so
yeah.
we
So
mark that.
it's absolutely, and you can do it in 2 ways. I mean, you could do it by saying, this is the kind of resource that we want to protect, you know, and be really kind of define the characteristics of a particular area that you would want to protect, and put that in like these siting guidelines. Or you can go right on the map and say, this beautiful field right here is off limits. We don't want that developed at all. You know, that R is a rooftop, an industrial rooftop, that the town might want to direct development toward. There might be a place, you know, like, you know, right in here, that's the town thinks that would be a really good place. And you know, if the town identifies a particular field or a particular type of resource as a preferred location, then the developer of that, if someone develops there, they actually get a premium for the electricity that they sell. So by putting that in your plan, you're strongly incentivizing solar development to go to that location as opposed to places where you don't want it. And when you get, like I said, there's not an expectation that towns are going to have this is gonna be an unending process, and the whole town is eventually gonna fill up with solar panels. You know, there's a limit of what we need, and what we want. And so, you know, there's some numbers and estimates about what that's gonna look like, yeah.
Have you given any thought to, like, if you identified a place to do something or not to do something, whichever one of these things it is, do you need to talk to the landowner before you do a designation, or the neighbors, or does anybody need to know? I mean, because you could suddenly say, okay, this would be a good place to put whatever, and the owner or the neighbors are like, we don't want that here. I mean, it's like, what kind of a process is anticipated with that going, you know, in terms of going through?
That's really up to the town, but I certainly would advise a public process that involves potential.
Before you get to the, here's the plan, adopt it.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, I would picture like working sessions around a table with the Planning Commission, Conservation Commission, whoever, and talking these things through. And if you start identifying, you know, like if you start putting big X's on, that might make that person very unhappy. That
Right.
You've taken
Right.
that off. Or if you put a preferred location on someone's lot, you might all of a sudden get a whole bunch of solar developers calling them at all hours of the day and night trying to get permission to develop there. So I think it's a very good idea that if you're getting real specific with locations, that you talk about with the property owners. There's no statutory requirement for that, but I think that's a good idea. So that's the end of the mapping, and then this is kind of the end of the presentation. I'm sure you're all delighted about that because it's probably 5 below zero outside now. We're thinking that we might get our plan adopted in February, the regional energy plan, but I suspect that may not happen until March, maybe February, March. I don't know. We're having a little bit of a few minor changes with the maps, which we hope are not too major, but enough so we're probably going to have to do a little bit of revising before our public hearings. But anyway, soon we'll have a regional energy plan. It's going to be entirely up to the Regional Planning Commission as to whether or not that's actually adopted. If it is adopted, then we'll submit it to the Public Service Department. And if the Public Service Department decides that it meets the standards, then we would get a determination of energy compliance, and our plan would have elevated status. And once our plan gets to that point, if it gets to that point, then towns that develop their plans would submit their plans to the Regional Planning Commission, and we would evaluate them based on those standards to see if they get a determination. If our plan doesn't get adopted by our local commission, or if it doesn't get approved by the state, towns can still get their plans approved by going directly to the Public Service Department. I think the Public Service Department is really going to try to work with us to get our plan approved, because I don't think the Public Service Department wants to review 250 town plans. That's my guess. But you know, if the town had a plan that they felt met all the standards next month, you could submit it to the Public Service Department next month and ask for your approval from them. And again, all those numbers, you know, all those, how much energy does your town use in different sectors and projections for the future, and all the maps that you can then customize at your town level, put X's on or whatever, those need to be available to you from us by the end of April. And, important one. So we've also been given a little bit of money to work directly with probably 3 towns this year to help them develop their plans. So, you know, we would probably look for some town, like a diversity of towns, maybe a big town, a small town, north town, south town, you know, something like that. So we'll be talking to folks. We've been kind of focusing on this regional plan at the moment and getting all of our data and maps together, but we'll be reaching out to towns. I've already talked to a bunch of towns. Dorset keeps knocking up.
Just very quickly, what in your grand vision here, from the time of April 2017, when all the towns have received the information that you've got for them, year, 2 years, 5 years before you honestly expect all the municipalities in the county to have prepared a plan and it be reviewed and you know, move on to the next step?
Right, so that's,
Rupert is not panicking yet, and I'd like to see what did it take to light a fire there? Not even listen.
So I really think, you know, that, well, what I know is that no one knows because no one has done this yet. There's not been a single plan, a municipal plan in the state of Vermont that's gone through this process. But what I'm thinking is when you've got the data and you've got the maps to work with, the really the key thing, the thing that towns are really going to have to think through, in addition to, you know, figuring out how they want to tweak the maps and the siting stuff, is coming up with some ideas, you know, for pathways to success, if you will, for, you know, what do we do for thermal, what do we do for transportation, how do we encourage more electricity. I would expect most towns would go to the recommendations that you get from the Department of Public Service or from the regional plan. So honestly, I don't think that, given the fact that the maps are already, the base maps, not the final maps, but the base maps are done for you, the data's done for you, every town in the region already has a good approved plan, and the fact that we've approved it already means that you're meeting the planning goals when it comes to, you know, land use and transportation. So it's more like just a check on the consistency with those things, developing some of these implementation ideas, and then pulling and customizing the data and maps. I don't see it as being a really huge thing. I think it's the kind of thing that a town could do in, you know, monthly planning commission or working group meetings, like in less than 6 months.
Is there a deadline for towns that choose to do this?
No.
No
You could,
deadlines whatsoever?
no, you could start next month, or you could start in 2035, as long as the law hasn't been repealed.
But see, but that's the other thing, is remember, no town has to do it. It's just the only way to get the Public Service Board to give your priorities some more consideration or substantial deference instead of due consideration, is to do this. But no town has to do it. The other thing is, don't we have to renew our town plans like every 5 years or something, or re-adopt them anyway? So, I mean, towns may be in different parts in that cycle. You know, like if Rupert is coming up on having to re-adopt his town plan next year, then that would be a really good opportunity to kind of try to fold this in. That would be one way I'd think about
Yeah,
it.
you
Because
could-
planning commissions are, in my experience, and I've been on the Arlington Planning Commission, you're not going out of your way to find more stuff to do. So, you know, if you could be folded into a process that's already happening, unless there's some kind of, you know, emergency red light reason to do it faster. That's what I would be thinking about.
Right, I mean, you can certainly do a plan amendment at any time, so you could
Yeah.
do this at any time you wanted to, but you're right, every 5 or 8 years, depending on your last adoption date, the plan needs to be updated. So I suspect that a number of municipalities will wait for the cycle to come around, but I don't know that. We may have 17 municipalities knocking on our door as soon as they watch this TV show. Yeah.
And presumably, you're going to be riding herd on these plans as they come in a little bit more carefully than you have in the past, to see that they're complying with the energy plan that you've committed the county to.
Well, it's our job, you know, when they were developing this legislation, we asked that part of it be inclusion of some kind of standards, because we didn't want these, we expected that, you know, because we approve town plans now anyway under the other criteria, that we'd probably be, as a regional planning commission, in the position of approving these energy elements. And we didn't want it to appear to be arbitrary at all. So certainly, if we're working with towns, we're going to keep a copy of those standards on the table to make sure that, you know, everybody is comfortable that the plan is addressing the standards. Yeah. I would not want people to go through 6 months worth of work and miss a few of those. You know, if you look at it, it's a long list, but you know, if you go through it, sit back, you know, have a beer, whatever, relax, don't panic. You know, it's really not that intimidating. It's not. I mean, it's a bit of work. There's no doubt about it, but it shouldn't be overwhelming. Yeah. And the biggest thing is, like I said, is that the law is the way I read it is, one, get towns to think about energy in a comprehensive way and get towns to clearly express what their desires are. Those are the two big things. So, Chris?
Well, I'm just reflecting on the obstacles to really making progress in this area. And I don't want to sound overly pessimistic, but we just had a national election in this country. 50% of the people in America don't believe that climate change exists or is man-made. If people believed the pronouncements of Bill McKibben at 350, they would get their guns and go to the courthouse and put a stop to stuff, but nobody believes it. Nothing was discussed about climate change, which is really the underlying issue here.
Yeah.
The last election, neither candidate spoke about climate change. There was practically no discussion of that issue. And so I think that, you know, the underlying necessity of this stuff is really questioned by a lot of people.
Oh, yeah, I don't think there's any question about that. I mean, I think that the climate change thing is one issue. It's one that I don't usually talk all that much about. Because
I wouldn't talk about it if I were
I
you.
think it's important, but I don't know, I think it's really important, but, you know, I don't, we could talk a lot offline about climate change. I think some of the things that really do resonate with people locally, and I'm talking locally, are more the kind of like the long-term energy security issues and the economic issues. You know, say, well, you remember a few years ago when gas all of a sudden spiked over $4 a gallon. That's coming again. You know, so
Oh, yeah.
what are we doing to plan for that, prepare for that when it
Right.
goes to $6 a gallon? I mean,
Right.
what that kind of thinking should motivate thinking and economics. You know, so like, you know, the town of Bennington spends close to $100 million a year on energy, right? That's money that comes out of people's pockets, and probably 75–80% of it goes away. If you could even capture 10 or 15% of that and keep it local, just by reducing the amount of oil that you're burning in buildings, or better yet, replacing that oil with you know, some wood chips that are obtained from, you know, local forestry businesses. You know, that's all to the economic good. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of assets. So regardless of what you think or Donald Trump thinks about climate change, I mean, there's a lot of really local benefits that should drive people or motivate people to do this stuff.
Those are good arguments, Jim.
Yeah. You have to come up with stuff like that when you're looking at President Trump. But anyway, any other thoughts? If you've got 2 minutes to fill out an evaluation form, that would be appreciated. If you don't, that's okay, but if you do, that'd be great. And thank you all for coming. And feel free to contact us with questions on any of this stuff. We'll be doing more outreach on the regional plan and on this stuff in the coming couple of months. And if any town wants us to come and talk directly to the town, just give us a call, and we'll do that too.
So we
Thank
get-
you.